Okay, hello everyone, welcome back to the second week of the workshop summer school, and today we're going to have a conversation with Gabriel Rockhill about one of his current book projects that has the title The Intellectual World War, Class Struggle in Theory. This is a project Gabriel's been working on for years, and it's because we've been in conversation about it for a long time. We wanted to just do an interview kind of like we've been doing with the other speakers. So we're going to go ahead and jump in. So starting, I know you guys read some of his text for today. So starting out, Gabriel, given your current work, and including the readings that people did for today, some people might be surprised to learn that you studied with Jacques Derrida here at the EHESS, and that you were deeply enmeshed in what is called deconstruction, the philosophy of difference, and post-structuralism, key components of French theory. So could you talk about your work in this arena, your intellectual itinerary, and what led to the kind of current perspective that you have on this tradition?
Okay. And we're hoping that the Zoom issues have been resolved, so bear with us. Well, thanks. I'm really excited to talk about this work. As Jen said, it's work that I've been doing basically for decades, but my perspective has changed rather significantly. And I would say that I've always been invested in forms of materialist analysis, as well as in forms of critical engagement that marshal intellectual tools for social transformation. But I also came up in a world that we could refer to as the belly of the beast, meaning the heart of the US empire, and did my early training in the 1990s. And so if you were in the 90s like me looking for radical theory, what was on offer was French theory and German-style critical theory. And that's what I was drawn to, because everyone around me was saying, well, this stuff is really changing the nature of the conversation, it is profoundly radical, you need to know these things. And so one of the elements they think that we'll get into in the conversation is that what I didn't know then, but that I now see very clearly retrospectively, is what I refer to as the intellectual apparatus. And this is drawing on the work of Brecht and many others. It's not like some concept I invented myself. It's part of a collective tradition of critique. And the intellectual apparatus is the entire system of intellectual production. So everything that goes into the production of ideas. This is universities, think tanks, the media, mass culture, so-called high culture, etc., but also the entire system of circulation. What ideas become part of the public sphere, circulate widely, are translated into other languages, what ideas are not circulated widely, and also consumption, right? Because there's a system of pre-programmed consumption that means that certain ideas are those, like myself, growing up in rural Kansas, was apt to consume because it was what was on offer. And so when I came to Paris I came in the mid-90s, and it was really the tail end of the grand era of French theory, and I began studying with Luce Rigoraj, then I did my master's with Jacques Derrida here at this institution, and then kind of went into classes with anybody that I could who was really famous in what I now understand is the global theory industry. Kristeva, Cixous, Paul Ricoeur, Lyotard, Laruelle, then I discovered Alain Badiou and Jacques Rancière. I ended up doing my dissertation with Badiou. And so I kind of just dove wholeheartedly into these traditions. And one of the things that I realized, given my dedication to materialist modes of analysis, is that first, I felt very insecure and that I needed to train myself in a whole series of things. And so I learned all the languages that I needed, and I thought, well, Derrida is the most prominent thinker, so I need to know Greek, I need to know Latin, I need to know German, I need to know French, and I need to know English. And so I taught myself those languages, and I dove into as well, not just his work, but then all of the work that he was reading. So the kind of canonical history of Western philosophy. And in doing that, I discovered that there were unspoken parameters to his theoretical practice. And so another key notion for me is a theoretical practice. I'm interested not simply in what people say or their ideas, but in their material practice qua intellectual. Not what they say they do, but what they actually do. And what Derrida actually does, I realized, and it ended up becoming both my dissertation and my first book, is he operates within a historically constituted intellectual practice that I would now refer to as bourgeois philosophy. And in bourgeois philosophy, what you do is you focus on a specific object of analysis, the canonized texts of the Western tradition. You concentrate on the quote-unquote genius producers of those intellectual products, so Leibniz and Kant and people like that. And thirdly, you engage in internal analysis, right? One of Derrida's most famous claims is that you can never analyze the context until you've exhausted the text, but the text is inexhaustible, so you never have to deal with the context, right? The thing is that this entire modality of philosophic engagement, which is integral to the bourgeois humanities, not just philosophy, but kind of theory writ large, is itself a historical product. And so I began mapping out, and this was my dissertation project and my first book, where this came from. Why is it that theorists or philosophers just interpret the world, and not even the world actually, they just interpret the canonized text rather than trying to interpret or understand the world, or even better, change the world. And so in that regard, I kind of did unearth a lot of the elements of bourgeois culture that I could now understand retrospectively from a relatively different vantage point. And a lot of that had to do with breaking with the kind of commodity fetishism of the global theory industry, right? Because when I first met Derrida, I was in awe. I thought he was a saint, could say no evil about him, no one would say evil about him, etc. But he's just a person, and in fact, he's a product of a system. And so my perspective changed quite radically. Instead of abiding by the golden calves that are just commodity fetishism within the global theory industry, began to see himself as a product, both his intellectual project and him as a person, like him as an intellectual. And so, that's one of my kind of first serious engagements with that. The other thing that I'll mention, I'll go through this quickly, is that deconstruction and post-structuralism has a reputation within the university as being rigorous because it analyzes texts very closely. And so I took that seriously, and I looked at what Derrida was writing, and I analyzed the text that he was analyzing. And what I found is that even within the parameters of internal analysis, what he was saying didn't correspond to the text that he was analyzing. So he wasn't even, within that theoretical practice, doing his job, so to speak. I've written extensively on this in some detail, but what I'd just like to highlight is that Derrida's intellectual project is ultimately idealist, meaning that everything that he engages in is put in relationship to what he calls the history of Western metaphysics. And Western metaphysics is this abstract, spectral set of ideas in which people think in binaries, and there's always one element of the binary that's privileged over another. And this modality of thinking is so prominent within the Western world that any text that he analyzes, he'll find the specters of Western Western metaphysics within it. And so one example that I'll just highlight in passing is I looked at his reading of Descartes, and he says, well, madness and reason, or madness and language, are incompatible by essence and in principle, because there's an essentialism throughout all of Derrida's writings. And therefore, Descartes must manifest this. And I read all of Descartes, and he didn't manifest that. In fact, Descartes says the opposite, and he says it very explicitly, including in both the Latin and French versions of the text that Derrida himself cites. And so there was a certain charlatanism about his work that really struck me and helped me, I guess, break a little bit with the saintly figure that he was. And there's also a rampant idealism because it's ideas that determine material realities, not the material realities themselves. So anyway, that's probably a little bit too much, but a little bit of the background of how I moved in registers from taking seriously certain elements from this theory industry to then, I guess, doing a concrete abstraction and looking at a higher level and seeing them actually as products of historical forces.
Having characterized, generally the theoretical practice that you critique, also I'd be curious what you think of, what about the politics of these figures that you were studying?
Yeah, so when I was here, 9/11 happened, 2001, right? And I remember it very explicitly because I was taking Derrida's seminar, and the next, week he had to address this because it was a major issue. And he knew nothing. He knew absolutely nothing about global politics, imperialism. It was embarrassing, quite frankly. And then he went on to write a book with Jürgen Habermas called The Concept, right? Not the reality, the concept of 9/11. And Jürgen Habermas, in case you don't know, he was a member of the Hitler Youth. he studied for 4 years with a person he called himself the Nazi philosopher, Martin Heidegger. He also endorsed the Persian Gulf War and NATO's intervention in Yugoslavia, right? So this is this guy's center of gravity politically. And so the response in this particular book, I think, is very poor. And he also, Habermas, condemned the anti-imperialist student activists as being left fascists, right? So obviously this reveals some of Derrida's political center of gravity, but it corresponds precisely to his overall orientation, because although he traffics in a very suspect form of opportunist recuperation of the specter of Marx, right? Only when he was a specter, only after the collapse of the Soviet Union, Derrida played a central role in rejuvenating the central importance of Martin Heidegger as the most important philosopher of the 20th century in the post-war era. Martin Heidegger was an unrepentant Nazi. And Adam Knoll's book on this is excellent, because he's not only a Nazi in his thinking and never apologized for it. Marcuse went and like basically asked him to, and he didn't. But he also was involved in the kind of administrative apparatus of Nazism, the purging of the university, etc. And so making Heidegger into this kind of grand figure, and then also worked very closely with Paul de Man. Paul de Man, if you don't know, is a fascist who worked as a Nazi collaborator, lied about it for years, but his biography is fascinating, because the way he ended up at Yale is he basically fabricated his own history in order to leverage his position into the university. And so Derrida not only rehabilitated fascists, he worked very closely with them, and then wrote obscurantist texts that attempted to pass them off for something that they weren't. Derrida himself, his center of gravity was perhaps at best liberal, but liberals, as we know, both politically and intellectually, are often, they work hand in glove with fascists in many ways, and I'd love to say more about that if people want to have a conversation about it. The other thing, though, and I'll just mention this in passing because it's part of my more recent research, Derrida was the co-president of the Jan Hus Educational Foundation that was founded in 1980 by a group of conservative British intellectuals, including Roger Scruton. Roger Scruton is on record saying that the CIA's intellectual war that it was waging, that was discovered, a lot of the front organizations were discovered in the 1960s, he said that the CIA should get back involved in directly funding intellectual warfare, basically anti-communist propaganda, right? So this isn't just conservative political orientation, it's a reactionary political orientation. And the Jan Hus Educational Foundation was an anti-communist organization that aimed at infiltrating, particularly Czechoslovakia, bringing in literature and philosophy in particular from the kind of free world or from the West, and then organizing seminars and things like this, led by philosophers who are anti-totalitarian philosophers like Derrida himself, and it was funded by the capitalist ruling class, including the Ford Foundation, Open Society Institute, the Margaret Thatcher Foundation, the US Embassy, the US Information Agency, the USIS, and perhaps most importantly, the National Endowment for Democracy. If you don't know the National Endowment for Democracy, it is, as Alan Weinstein said in 1991, he's on record as saying that a lot of what we do today in the National Endowment for Democracy was done covertly 25 years ago by the CIA, right? So basically he was involved in a kind of anti-communist propaganda campaign that was funded by the NED, which is a cutout for the Central Intelligence Agency. A last thing that I'll say about Derrida, because I could say a lot of things and I'd be happy to return to this, is that one of the interviews that really reveals his center of gravity, he says, quote, "I cannot construct finished or plausible sentences using the expression social class. I don't really know what social class means." So here we have an intellectual proffering forth, as if his subjective point of view was supposed to be objective reality, that class doesn't exist because he can't construct a sentence with it. It's not his problem that as a petty bourgeois intellectual he can't construct a sentence with it, and that doesn't mean that it doesn't exist, right? So this is another manifestation of his idealism. He goes on in the same interview recycling straw person versions of Marxism, calling Marxism reductivist and economistic, basically demonstrating his profound ignorance of the Marxist tradition. He says that some engagement, his criticism of Marxists, he says that some engagement with Heidegger or a problematic of a Heideggerian type should be mandatory, right? So basically, he's saying that Marxists should be obliged to read Nazis. Right? This is this guy's political center of gravity. So in a nutshell, I find that there's really little or nothing politically to be learned from Derrida's project, other than to learn how an opportunist reactionary anti-communist was promoted within the global theory industry as being the most brilliant thinker in the history of humanity.
But after working with Derrida and in this tradition, you then went on to work more in the kind of with the work of Rancière, Foucault. So can you talk about kind of how you would characterize that tradition, why you moved into it, how you see it, and why you developed the critiques that you have of it now?
Yeah, so given the materialist basis of my orientation, I always wanted to test claims, and that's basically what I did with Derrida's approach. And it's not just Derrida, right? It's also Nancy and Lacoulabart and Sixou and Kristeva. Like, there's a lot of people who traffic in this kind of post-structuralist or decon approaches. I was then attracted more to Foucault, to Rancière, to Bourdieu, and others who were doing, at least in appearance, some modality of materialist analysis. And what I found is that they also had a reputation for doing radical politics, right? And that I thought was really interesting. But one of the things that I identified, and I'll just unpack this here for a second, is that if Derrida was an idealist, and I think is an idealist, what you find ultimately in Foucault and Rancière is what we can refer to, pardon the philosophic term, but I think it's helpful, is transcendental idealism. And so transcendental idealism, which of course dates from Kant, and Kant theorized it, is a little bit different than idealism. It's a specific form of idealism. Idealism just says that, you know, the mind, spirit, metaphysics drive the world, and the empirical world is just a manifestation of the spiritual or discursive or intellectual forces. Transcendental materialism says, no, there's an empirical world. There actually is an empirical world. And so what transcendental materialism does, or transcendental idealism, is it takes empirical elements from the world and then frames them within a transcendental conceptual apparatus that purports to explain them, right? This is different than just empiricism, right? Empiricism presumes that there's just brute facts that are out there and we have to, you know, map them and analyze them. And what I think we find in both not only Foucault, but also Rancière and many other thinkers working in these traditions, is that they take empirical data, right? What I liked about Foucault is he was actually reading things, right? Seriously, he was in the archives, and Rancière does the same thing. Like, he's run a ton of bourgeois literature in the European tradition, no doubt, and knows it backwards and forwards. But what did they do with that empirical content? That's what I think is important. What they do is they have a transcendental framework that they shoehorn this empirical data within. And so what is ultimately determinant is that transcendental framework. If it be the epistemes, or if it be the regimes of art that Rancière talks about, or other such things. And ultimately, what this is a modality of analysis that is not dialectical. Meaning that the power of the historical materialist tradition, or one of the elements from the historical materialist tradition that is important, is it recognizes, yeah, there's an objective material world that's out there, but we are a product of that world. So the very separation between mind and world, that is the basis for transcendental idealism, but also for empiricism or just pure idealism, is based on a kind of substantive approach and a reification and an opposition between mind and world. Historical materialism dialectically demonstrates, though, that we as Homo sapiens are products of a material world, and so our thought process is only elements of nature that come to reflect back upon nature itself. And that dialectical relationship is essential, because what it means is that our own categories of understanding always need to be tested in relationship to that material world of which we are a part, right? So there's a dialectical feedback loop. Something is true not because it's a transcendental structure that stands above history and purports to define all empirical data. It's true because whatever conceptual framework you establish, you're constantly testing it in the empirical world and in practice, and you're changing it when it doesn't work, right? So this dialectical and historical materialist approach is markedly different than idealism, empiricism, or transcendental idealism. I don't know, maybe that's enough on that particular point, because I could say more about this, but both Foucault and Rancière really do, it's also a kind of pseudo-materialism, because when you compare what it is they're analyzing to their framework of analysis is highly idiosyncratic, right? And so my engagement with both of these thinkers wasn't just reading what they wrote, it was reading all the things that they wrote, or that they were reading, and then comparing them to other analysts of the same topics. And finding that, well, that's really strange that, you know, someone like Foucault would say that, well, there's no longer these like horrific displays of corporeal punishment anymore. Like, this is in an age of Guantanamo Bay and Abu Ghraib. Like, what planet are you on? And lynchings, and like, just look at the history of the United States. Like, you can't just make these massive transcendental demarcations and act as if, you know, this idiosyncratic version of history mapped onto actual material history. And so by comparing and contrasting their transcendental accounts of history to other material accounts of history, I recognized that they were highly limiting, and that also they were largely premised on trying to come up with some like absolutely new and individual understanding of the world that no one had arrived at before. And one of the powers of the historical materialist tradition is that that's not how it works. Like, one individual doesn't rise above everyone else as a saintly figure and bestow upon humanity the gospel. No, people work together to figure things out, and we have more brain power when we work together. And it's a collective tradition of elucidation, right? And so that idiosyncratic nature, I think, it also is just part of their brand management, because ultimately what they wanted to do was to ratchet up their symbolic capital within the global theory industry. And you don't do that by working with others and by developing modes of analysis that are collective. You do that by saying, everyone else is wrong. Here's my new concept. Here's my new idea of the 19th century. And I find that now, in retrospect, to be not only problematic, but ultimately to be a product of how commodified intellectual production operates under the global theory industry. And I should probably have said, I've trafficked in this myself, like, mea culpa. For sure. There's plenty of my own writings where I look back at them and cringe and think, oh, that neologism doesn't really explain anything. It's not helpful. It's just me trying to wave my hands and look, you know, more impressive than somebody else. So I probably should have led with that, because my own critiques, I think the beginning points of all of my own critiques were self-critique. And when 9/11 happened and the political stuff that I was talking about earlier, actually that was the worst. It wasn't as bad that Derrida couldn't explain it. It was that people were asking me, you're this sophisticated Parisian intellectual, what's going on here? And I was like, well, I don't know, you know, différence. That was about all I had. It was pretty embarrassing. And so the motivation for a lot of this critical orientation was really a self-critique and realizing that I didn't have the tools that were necessary to understand what's going on.
Well, and I'll ask you the same thing then. Before having characterized the kind of theoretical practice of these figures, what is your assessment of their politics? In case people didn't maybe catch that from the title of the article on Foucault.
Yeah, I know the article, if you were able to read it, it was probably hard to suss out what my position was, because it was so kind of clothed in academic references, and I was hiding my own politics and whatnot. I think it's pretty clear that Foucault he's a rabid anti-communist. There was only a brief moment in the wake of '68, and he was following the way that the wind blew. The students were radical, everybody's radical around him, and so he donned the leather jacket and kind of did the radical chic look, and it worked. It worked really, really well. It took me a long time, because I kept reading these things in his text and thinking, well, isn't that the guy with the microphone and the bald head, and he went S&M and all that? Like, he's a radical, right? But no, he's not. He's a rabid anti-communist who is very, very close to some of the most conservative figures in the French intelligentsia, in particular André Glucksmann, who's basically made an entire career out of anti-communist propaganda. So I can leave maybe Foucault by the wayside, or we'll come back to him if people have questions about it. Regarding Rancière, I mean, I've written a lot on Rancière's politics, and so both in my book, Radical History and the Politics of Art, and in Interventions in Contemporary Thought, I've gone through a lot of these details, but Rancière is an anarchist who traffics in certain forms of liberalism. And he's an anti-Marxist and an anti-communist. And he's been very, very explicit about this on numerous occasions. He is somebody whose political framework basically takes certain forms of insurgent anarchism, because anarchism is a rich and broad tradition, there are lots of elements to it, but it takes a certain form of insurgent anarchism that you can find kind of in the 19th century, and then he universalizes it, right? So there's really no historicity to politics in Rancière. There is a trans-historical confrontation between what he calls the police order, or the kind of given distribution of bodies in a political order, and then interruptions of that police order, which is what he calls politics, or politics proper, or la politique. And this confrontation is the transcendental framework that I was talking about earlier, and any empirical content from the entire history of the world is then shoehorned within this transcendental framework. That transcendental framework itself is highly problematic because the biggest takeaway is that you never will have a world without a police order. So a world without exploitation, without oppression, a world of liberation is off the table. All that you can have are these anarchist-like moments of destabilization where the given order is then reorganized in potentially better ways, right? So he's basically saying there's no way out. There's only capitalism and insurgent confrontations with capitalism. In other words, he traffics in Tina. There is no alternative, or again, in a subtle reference in the other article that you might not have picked up on because it was also probably a little too refined in its politics, what I called ABS theory, anything but socialism. And that theory is more specifically, and it's easier to do this in oral presentation, it's ABS theory, right? It's a theory that is full of, because it is a theory that excludes from the global history of humanity the entire socialist project. And that doesn't mean that then you have to blindly accept everything that's ever occurred under the banner of socialism. But you can't just exclude particularly the entire global South orientations towards the attempt to break with imperialism and capitalism and introduce alternatives. So this is the form of politics that Rancière traffics in. And one other thing that I'll just say quickly on this is that what I was interested in when I was really into his work is testing his theory. And what I quickly realized is there's no possibility of theory exportation. Because I thought, well, okay, if we believe that there are police orders and insurgent moments, there was a moment in 2005 in France when there were enormous uprisings, particularly within the quote-unquote immigrant community, which are basically the communities who continue to be treated as immigrants within France due to the fact that colonialism is still just a very big part of the French Republic. And there were major revolts, cars were being burned down, symbols of the French Republic were being burned down, the buses were being burned down. And I thought, wow, this is a moment of politics, right? These people are insurgently calling into question the distribution of the body politic. Rancière came out and said, no, it's not. It's not politics because they have not formulated their demands in such a way that the state, that they take basically the bourgeois state as somebody to have a discussion with. Meaning, he was completely denigrating all of these moments of insurgent uprising and saying, who gets to decide? Is there a theory that we can test collectively and see if it works? No. It's the theorist who gets to understand, or who gets to judge, right? It's the genius who stands above history and says, this is the order of things. And I had debates with him about this, and I said, look, according to your theory, this seems pretty clear. Unless you're just a French chauvinist and you don't want to recognize that, colonial subjects might actually have political agency, which is also another thing that we could get into, the social chauvinism that plagues a lot of his work. And he wasn't having any of it, so he also traffics in certain forms of liberalism. So proper politics will abide by the rules of the liberal state. And this is another problem that I would point to.
And I want to start talking about your work on the CIA, and how did you move from, somebody working on French theory to then, and as well as German critical theory, to then having an interest in the CIA. And speaking about that, could you also kind of explain what the CIA really indexes, since it's not just about the agency?
Yeah, I might just start with a quick poll, if I could, a straw poll. How many people have read like rigorous analyses of either the history of the CIA or how the Central Intelligence Agency operates? Just a quick show of hands, and it's not, I'm not testing you here, I'm just kind of curious. So it's 1, 2, 3, okay. How many people have seen either a James Bond movie or a Mission Impossible movie? Right? Quick show of hands, a little embarrassing, I know, okay. Well, my point here is that the dominant understanding of the Central Intelligence Agency is mediated by the Central Intelligence Agency. I have a quick quote here, or quick notes here. So 1,947 screen products, TV shows and movies, have been supported by the Department of Defense. And 114 screen products have been supported by the OSS, CIA, FBI, including, for one screen product, these are long-running TV shows like 24, Homeland, etc. So the James Bond film, Mission Impossible, there's a lot of great scholarship on this, but National Security Cinema is one of the solid books on this. And so what they've done is they've created the image of themselves so that people are confused about how they actually operate. This is important because the Central Intelligence Agency is, and it came out of the Office of Strategic Services, which was the wartime intelligence service, and of course a deeper history of MI6 in Great Britain, who they learned from and then incorporated and collaborated with. The Central Intelligence Agency, they largely have two branches that are important. One branch that has been widely studied and understood, Killing Hope by William Bloom is one of the best books on the topic, is the death arm, right? The Central Intelligence Agency has been responsible for killing a minimum of 6 million people worldwide between 1947 and 1987, according to 14 former members of the Central Intelligence Agency who did a study in the late 1980s. So there's that element of all of the coup d'etat, destabilization efforts, etc., overthrowing a minimum, or attempting to overthrow 50 foreign governments, the majority of which were democratically elected, since World War II alone, right? But the other element that is unbelievably important and understudied, and it's one of the reasons that I got interested in it, is research and analysis. The OSS, the predecessor organization of the CIA, had set up a research and analysis branch. The numbers vary depending on who you look at, but between about 1,200 and 2,000 full-time researchers were working for the OSS, and this was the model for the Central Intelligence Agency. They actually recruited an innumerable number of university professors, particularly from the Ivy Leagues and the elite institutions, to do research and analysis globally. This is a big part of what they do. In fact, according to two analysts that I know, the OSS Research and Analysis Branch was the largest think tank, or largest grouping of researchers in the history of the United States, and set the agenda for post-war American social science, right? And the people involved in the OSS, there's many of them, right? Herbert Marcuse, Franz Neumann, a lot of the leading luminaries of the kind of post-war social sciences. In fact, if my memory serves me right, 7 presidents of the American Historical Association in the post-war era were former OSS members. And the joke in the CIA is that nobody ever leaves the CIA. So former is a bit of a euphemism. It means that you're an intelligence operator and you have contacts to the bourgeois state. So that is an important context, I think, to understand. The other thing that I would say is that you shouldn't get hung up on the CIA. It's like, you know, as soon as you bring it up, people, even people in the know, it will evoke a whole series of connotations. There's a lot of other agencies involved in this type of work. Not only the intelligence agencies, but also the private intelligence agencies, and a lot of other various governmental agencies. And the central goal of the CIA is to internationalize capitalist social relations. And if they do it through the stick, or more perhaps appropriately, the gun, or they do it through the carrot of propaganda, and through the carrot of the mind management of global humanity, the objective is the same. right? So the CIA is not the real story. The real story is who they're working for, right? They work for the capitalist ruling class and they work for bourgeois states in order to manage the global population. Ralph McGee, I'm not sure exactly how to pronounce his last name, but he was in the CIA for 25 years, and he said that the central function of the CIA is global disinformation, right? That's why I think this organization is important and understudied. And so that's one of the reasons that I kind of turned to and began investigating some of the work that they were doing, in part because I kept coming across references to work that they were doing, and some of my early work looked at the rise of American art in the post-war era and why the center of cultural production shifted from Paris to New York City, and there's a lot of great work on this. Why did the abstract expressionists and the pop artists and all these people become so famous? Well, the Central Intelligence Agency was actually really deeply involved in promoting it. And they work with the private museums in the United States. They pour funds into supporting US culture because part of the goal was they didn't want the global population to think that the Americans were crass and that they were just chewing bubble gum and smoking cigarettes and drinking Coca-Cola. They wanted the global message to be, they're reading Faulkner and going to see Jackson Pollock. They're a sophisticated, it's basically like Imperial Rome, right? They wanted to project an image of imperial power that wasn't just Walt Disney and like crass base culture, and so they funded and supported it. And that was one of my kind of gateway drugs into this world. And then I began to discover how much they were involved in the intellectual world. In fact, according to the Church Committee report in 1975, the CIA was involved with thousands of academics at hundreds of universities. This is a quote, right? That is an enormous, enormous operation. The deeper you dig into this, though, the more complicated it becomes, because I found out that the person who wrote the Church Committee report himself was CIA, and the report was vetted by the CIA, and that the exploration of both the academics and the journalists, because an inordinate number of journalists who are CIA, was cut short because the people who were investigating in this congressional investigation began to discover, wow, there's a lot going on here in the university and the journalistic world, so they cut it off and said, okay, we'll do what's called a limited hangout. Limited hangout in intelligence parlance is you give people a little bit of something so that you can then control the narrative, right? So that was kind of part of the background, and then maybe one of the other things that's important for the work that I'm doing now is that unlike a kind of standard image that some people have of the CIA where somebody come with a briefcase full of cash and leave it in a professor's office, and then the professor's going to write some really crass propaganda or whatnot. That does happen, and I've seen a lot of examples of that happening, but it actually mainly functions differently, and that is that they control the apparatus of intellectual production. The entire system of production, circulation, and consumption is not just controlled directly by the CIA or something like that, but they have a hand in so many different aspects of it, along with a lot of other agencies and along with the foundations, Ford, Rockefeller, Carnegie, etc., which are basically their ways of managing capitalist wealth for intellectual and cultural propaganda. And if you look at the history of these foundations, as I have, they work hand in glove, right? So the Ford Foundation has a CIA liaison. You look at the history of who worked for the Ford and who worked for CIA, they go back and forth. These are hand-in-glove operations. Rockefeller's the same. Nelson Rockefeller himself was a super coordinator of US intelligence and oversaw the CIA, which was an intelligence and propaganda organization for all of Latin America. And so we have to see the kind of larger picture and not think, oh, there's the private world over here where there's the capitalists and then there's the public world. This is liberal mythology. They work really, really hand in glove. And so I guess connecting this to some of the theoretical elements, I began to ask really basic questions like, well, why was some curious, farm boy from Kansas like myself drawn to Paris and French theory? Like, how did that happen? What were the kind of systemic coordinates that put me on that particular path? And I looked into the history of French theory, its reception in the United States. And I always knew, oh, there's this famous conference in 1966 at Johns Hopkins where they brought over French structuralism. And many people have written that this was the grand arrival of French theory. And I began to look at, well, who was invited and who was paying for this? Right? Really basic material questions, which I think we should always ask. Well, the people who were invited were not people like Louis Althusser, because he was a member of the Communist Party. So he was a Marxist and he was a persona non grata in the kind of, the remnants of the McCarthy era US political orientation. So there weren't Marxists who were invited, with the potential exception of Lucien Goldmann, who's a debatable figure. So there's already a filtering, right? It's the kind of transatlantic translation regime, make sure that the people who are circulating are the people who should be circulating. So Derrida, Deleuze, Lacan, people like this. And it was the Ford Foundation who invested millions of dollars in this conference, and then a series of publications and other conferences related to it that brought this phenomenon. And knowing more about the history of the Ford Foundation and the type of cultural production, they were interested in the promotion of intellectual anti-communism globally, right? And that was part of the project. The piece, if you had time to read it, on the Frankfurt School also looks a lot into this, right? Where was their funding coming from? It was a capitalist ruling class. Why was the capitalist ruling class doing this? They say it, like I quoted in the article, they funded them because they were towing the line that they wanted major intellectuals who were radicals to toe, in particular doing things like Horkheimer did, supporting the US imperial intervention in Vietnam, or the French, British, and Israeli imperialist intervention in Egypt, right? They were doing the good work that the capitalists and imperialists wanted them to do. And so we have to think of this dialectically, right? It's not, and unfortunately there's been some slander campaigns, unsurprisingly, against me. It's not that there are, these intellectuals who are just, getting cash and then like writing what they should write and things like this. Instead, there's a phenomenon of uplift. And if I think about it in these terms, the intellectual apparatus, this entire system of production, circulation, and reception, which is a big part of the superstructure within capitalist societies, has an enormous amount of control. And within that, if you want to climb your way up, you're an undergraduate, you want to go to grad school, you want to do a postdoc, you want to maybe get a job, maybe you want to get a job at a prestigious university, we all know how to do that. You do not do that by becoming, a specialist in Thomas Sankara. You do not do that by, trafficking in ideas that are linked to transforming the world. The way you do that is you give to the intellectual apparatus what it wants. And there's a kind of suction that is like uplift. And the more you give the system what it wants, the higher you'll rise within that system. And again, I have trouble being so self-deprecating at times because I'm like, oh, I tried so hard to do well. But I suffered from this enormously, right? The reason I got a job is because I was hired as a French theorist and I translated Rancière into English. And doing that meant that I was invited to junkets and I got keynotes and people were like, wanted to cozy up with me. I was feeling important and I was feeling relevant because I was doing radical theory, right? So it hasn't served me well to understand better how that system works and think, I don't want uplift in a system like that. I don't want to be contributing to that type of overall orientation. Yeah.
Well, given everything that you talked about, the global misinformation campaigns, I'd be curious to hear what, the critical theorists and French theorists, kind of known as the masters of suspicion, what analyses of that did they have?
Yeah, I should maybe just back up and add one other thing to that. And this, I'm going to be very quick on it, but I'd happy to go into greater detail if people want to talk about it. It's a big part of my contemporary research. And I should also add as a proviso, this is not research that I found on Wikipedia or that, was on some blog. I've done an unbelievable number of Freedom of Information Act requests to get internal documents that aren't available, but that are now, some of them are available as part of the public record. I've done interviews, I've done archival research. I've actually, of course, read a lot on the history of the intelligence agencies and things like this. So the things I'm about ready to say that might be surprising are based on verifiable facts. And often, what I do is I always, cross-reference and compare and contrast. And so a lot of what I'm going to tell you is it's straight from the horse's mouth. These are intelligence operatives in MI6, CIA, FBI, etc., who have admitted what they were doing. And there are two organizations, at least, that I think should be on everybody's radar. One is the Information Research Department. The Information Research Department, or the IRD. This was set up by the British Foreign Office. It worked with MI6. MI6 is just the kind of CIA equivalent, more or less, within British intelligence. And it later worked closely with the Central Intelligence Agency. The role of the IRD, it was set up in 1948 by the Labour government, right? By the Labour government. Actually, well, I'll get into that in a second, because it's important that it was a Labour government. It is an international anti-communist propaganda research center that's secret, private, and has had unbelievably far-reaching consequences. It has contacts with newspapers and magazines and news agencies, and it runs publishing houses. It had its own publishing house. It worked with academic institutions, radio stations, regularly collaborated with the BBC, with London Press Service, with Reuters. It placed its people in the media and in the academic world. This is a quote, just to sum up. This is by Hugh Wilford, who has done some good scholarship on this. He says, by 1950, the IRD had succeeded in establishing permanent channels for the routine transmission of its by now considerable output of anti-communist propaganda all over the world. Right? So they have a global network of anti-communist propaganda. Does anyone know the story of George Orwell and his communist list? Right? He released a list of 135 suspected communists to the IRD. Right? He was in direct contact with a woman who worked for the IRD. He's a snitch. He gave them information on people that he thought were communists, and the IRD had an enormous hand in making George Orwell what he is today, and why I read him in high school in rural Kansas, because they translated him into at least 20 different languages. They created an animated version of Animal Farm. They collaborated with the CIA on a feature-length film based on the same book. And they worked with intellectuals like Bertrand Russell, Arthur Koestler, Milosz, Kravchenko, many others, and many of the leading specialists, quote unquote, in the history of the Soviet Union were IRD. They worked with the IRD and in certain cases published books in which they took IRD files, put them in their own name, and then published them. In particular, Robert Conquest's book, The Great Terror, Stalin's Purge of the 30s, drew extensively on IRD files. David Barzilay, the Oxford historian H.J.P. Taylor, Leonard Shapiro at the London School of Economics, Brian Crozier. The list is actually extraordinary when you go into it. And this made me think, when I came across this information, I said, oh, that's why I thought that it was, the Soviet Union was just blood and terror and horror, and because they're pumping this stuff out, and it's given academic credentials. It's quite smart when you think about it, right? The way they've done the operation, because and they knew it, right? They couldn't just pump it out in pure propaganda and right-wing outlets. They wanted academic credentials, and they wanted in particular to work with academics and intellectuals who had some left-wing credibility. And in particular, those who were communist dissidents, those who had lost the quote-unquote faith, as if communism was a faith as opposed to like an orientation that you would believe in because it makes sense or something like that, right? It's just that's a form of liberal projection in many ways. So that's an important organization. The other organization is the Congress for Cultural Freedom, the CCF. The Congress for Cultural Freedom is a CIA-front organization whose power arguably exceeded that of the IRD. It picked up on a lot of the work of the IRD. The IRD, the numbers they had about 400 to 600 full-time propagandists working for them. Right? Think about that for a second. What do we got, like 35 people here in the room? Imagine if we had 200 or 400 to 600, and we had full-time funding, and the only thing we did was anti-communist propaganda, right? And we just pumped it out, pumped it out, and pumped it out. That's an enormous amount of resources, right, in the intellectual apparatus. The Congress for Cultural Freedom far surpassed that. It was established in 1950. It had offices in some 35 countries. It mobilized an army of 280 employees, and it supported some 50 prestigious journals around the world. So it ran Encounter magazine, the Paris Review, Der Monat in Germany, Preuve in Paris. Quest in India, many others. It published at least 170 books. It ran forum service, which broadcast free of charge and all over the world reports from its intellectuals in 12 different languages. It reached 600 newspapers and 5 million readers, right? Enormous operation. It was blown, the cover was blown by Ramparts magazine in 1966, investigative journalists who revealed that it was a CIA front organization, run by Michael Josselson. It was headquartered in Paris, and Michael Josselson was CIA, and he referred to the Congress for Cultural Freedom as our big family, right? It was kind of like a mafia, right? Our big family had a budget in 1966 of $2 million, which is the equivalent today of $18 million, right? And what's surprising, maybe, is that this was only a very small part of what Frank Wisner of the CIA called the mighty Wurlitzer. Wurlitzer was a kind of jukebox, and so he wanted and established a system by which, in Langley, Virginia, at CIA headquarters, he could press a button on the jukebox or on the Wurlitzer and have the same story play worldwide. If you were, I wasn't necessarily shocked, but I was flabbergasted by the lockstep of the global corporate media when it was decided that the COVID crisis wasn't going to be solved and that we were going to pivot to war in Ukraine, war against Russia, war against China. That corporate infrastructure is still very, very prevalent. And I could come back to this, but you know, the CIA employed minimum 400 journalists, but it's most likely much, much more than that. It depends on what different accounts you look at. This is Carl Bernstein's account in the mid-70s, I believe. They also work hand in glove with the New York Times, with all of the major corporate media outlets. Cooper, what's his name? Anderson Cooper, interned with the CIA. Carlson Tucker apparently tried to get a job with the CIA. Apparently didn't work out, but of course Tucker Carlson is like William F. Buckley Jr. He gives to the system what it wants. It's almost, people like that you don't need to employ them, you know, because they're already doing the work that you want them to do. And there's much more that I could say about this because there are other levels to this. It goes much, much deeper, but I just bring all of that in because part of the agenda in the intellectual world war was not to fight a crass right-wing war against the socialist alternative. The real goal was to split the left by shoring up what they call the compatible left. And the compatible left can be liberals, social democrats, Trotskyists, Maoists, anarchists, as long as, and that's the fundamental dividing line, as long as they're opposed to any and all forms of actually existing socialism. Meaning, as long as they say, at the end of the day, there is no alternative to capitalism, they're part of the compatible left. And so the agenda was to shore up the compatible left, sever it from the non-compatible left, the socialist left, and particularly the revolutionary socialist left, but you know, even not revolutionary, but just those who would support socialism, and to completely discredit and destroy the socialist left. So one of the things that's flabbergasting, finally answering your question, sorry for the detour, is that in 1966, it was revealed, and you can look at the global press at that point in time, that the Congress for Cultural Freedom was this enormous global propaganda organization that all of these intellectuals were involved in. Raymond Aron, A-R-O-N, not necessarily very well known in the United States, but one of the very visible philosophers in France, who wrote, is it The Opium, what's the title of the book? The Opium of the Intellectuals, I think it is. He's just anti-communist screed after anti-communist screed. Personal friend of Henry Kissinger, and he was the face of the Congress for Cultural Freedom, right? He was also someone who was very important because he was the mentor to a lot of people in the French intelligentsia at that point in time, played an enormous role within French social sciences. Hannah Arendt had ties in various ways to both the intelligence services in Great Britain and to the New York intellectuals. Sidney Hook and James Burnham were philosophy professors at NYU, but they moonlighted as CIA. And so the number of intellectuals who were involved was quite extensive. Horkheimer went to CIA conferences, Congress for Cultural Freedom conferences. You look at the conference lineup, and they're all the kind of rad libs of the day, right? And so that blew up. And there's not a single reference in any of the figures that I've studied in German critical theory or French so-called critical theory that so much as reference its existence. Not a word. Absolute silence. Right? And these are people who literally were at the same institution, studied at the same institute, studied with these people, often published with them, or themselves were involved in these junkets. Right? And so that, to me, communicated very clearly that this modality of so-called critical theory has its limits. And one of the fundamental limits is that it's incapable of criticizing the very institutions or the very intellectual apparatus that has promoted it as the best commodity on the market, right? And so just as a quick counterfactual, like imagine if in one of Foucault's seminars, there was one session where he said, oh, there's a Congress for Cultural Freedom, which was a CIA front organization, and all these French intellectuals were involved in it, and this is what the microphysics of power looks like. This is how institutions control and manage minds. Everybody who's involved in the intelligentsia in some capacity would have caught wind of it. And you listening to me now, you wouldn't be surprised. You'd be like, oh yeah, he's rehashing that thing about Foucault that we all learned about like a long time ago, right? But in my case, the fact that I'm one of the, there are others, of course, one of the people who's bringing this to the fore, reveals to me it's, I think, less interesting from a kind of subjective level than an objective level. What does this demonstrate about how this intellectual apparatus works and what the limits of critique are within that intellectual apparatus? And the limits, I think, are really clear. And then the other thing that I'll add to this, just the political horizons then become very clear, right? Because people like Adorno and Horkheimer, they were very critical of capitalism and consumer society and have written some very good things on that. Critique of the culture industry and various modes of analysis of how desire and need is constructed by capitalist social relations and consumerism. There are resources, within the Frankfurt School that I've read extensively and learned from. But as bad as capitalism is, the alternative is much, much worse. And so the heinous, racist things that they say about the Soviets, about the Chinese, about the Koreans, about the Vietnamese, about Latin Americans, they don't even talk about Cuba. Adorno's family kind of went through Cuba, but there's no reference whatsoever to the first major socialist revolution within the Western Hemisphere. And so it began to make me think a little bit differently about what this radical theory was that I was attracted to, and I thought, oh, okay, this is the compatible left. And then you start to connect the dots, and it all makes sense, right? Because when you think, and we could cycle back and should to like Zizek and Badiou, would be interesting, because I studied with Badiou and I've read a lot of Zizek, probably too much. And so they're interesting figures, because you think, well, these people are Marxists, right? Like, wow, they're like revolutionaries, and you can tell from their book covers, because there's like stuff on fire, and they're like making symbols or wearing red or whatever. But what's unique about them is that actually there's a fundamental consensus. And that fundamental consensus, there can be a little bit of wavering, and you have to look at the details. But they tend to be anti-party. They're against political organizing at a party level. Parties are bad. Parties are bad because when you're in a party, then you're organized in such a way that the rank and file is disciplined by leadership, and there's a focal point and modes of organizing that are hierarchical, that are top-down, et cetera, which I'll just say as a side note is a complete misrepresentation of how parties actually work, particularly good parties. But we could come back to that if you want. The other thing is they're anti-state. They're all for forms of resistance that do not succeed. As long as you're struggling and getting crushed, they'll support you. They'll say, yeah, we are, some of them, it depends, of course, we have to look at the individual cases, but most of them will be like, yeah, we're in support of the Palestinian people. Right? If the Palestinian people establish a socialist state, I don't think they'd be saying the same thing. In fact, I'm certain they wouldn't be saying the same thing, because it's not what they say about Cuba, it's not what they say about Nicaragua, it's not what they say about China, it's not on and on and on, right? Which is not to say, of course, I would never advocate for a kind of, you know, blind engagement where you just say, well, everything that is a state that presents itself as socialist should just be like blindly supported, or it means that, you know, it's absolutely perfect, or anything like that. On the contrary, I believe in a kind of dialectics of socialism, where you have to look at all of the nuances and analyze them. But these people, these radical theorists on the compatible left, they don't do that. And in fact, one of the other amazing features of almost every single one of them is that they'll go on at length about how you cannot whisper in a hallway the slightest critique of Adorno, unless you slept in his archive, read the personal letter that he sent to you on his deathbed, and, you know, learned all of the things that he himself studied, on and on and on. You can't be critical. But when it comes to actually existing socialism, not only can you be critical, you can be critical without ever having studied any aspect of it whatsoever. So people that I studied with, for the most part, they don't know anything about what's going on in the places that I've just named. They've never studied them seriously. Usually they don't have the language skills to do it anyway. They don't care. And they just say, it's all to be condemned, it's awful, and it's horrible, right? And so what that is just a kind of ideological moral reflex that's ascientific, that's lacking in rigor, and that was also highly politically suspect. Because if there's a real problem with socialism, then let's figure out what it is. Let's study it, right? Let's figure out what's working and what's not working. And so that overall consensus within the compatible left, I think, is precisely why they've been shored up. And so the most famous Marxists in the world today are famous within the capitalist world. And they're famous for a reason. They're famous because they toe the line that needs to be towed. And that is that, as bad as capitalism is, the alternative is much, much worse. And so, what is to be done? The answer to Lenin's question? Nothing at all, but read my books, right? And I can explain to you how horrible capitalism is, and how we shouldn't be organized, and shouldn't get involved in any way, shape, or form in supporting projects that might, if we studied them, be leveraging power away from global capital, right? So it's a defeatist politics. It's a defeatist politics through and through. And of course there are different versions of this, right? I'll just give a quick shout out to my man Zizek, because he came out, I mentioned this in French, but people might not have gotten it. He, of course, said that we should vote for Donald Trump in the most recent election. And his justification for that was, you might think, oh, he's a Marxist accelerationist, right? We vote for Trump, then it gets really bad, and then it's going to catapult the revolution. But no, hear me out. The reason we should vote for Trump is because that's going to force the Democratic Party to get really radical. And then the Democratic Party is going to, like, save us or something? I don't know. Like, he doesn't know anything about the history of the Democratic Party. And these myths have been going on again and again and again. Like, people are saying this about Reagan, people are saying, like, just know your history. And he himself is an anti-communist dissident, right? That's how he cut his teeth in Yugoslavia, right? He ran on a presidential ticket against the communists, on the liberal ticket, right? And he just came out in support of the NATO intervention in Ukraine and wrote this piece for The Guardian, which is basically an intelligence cutout for British intelligence. The IRD has many, many links historically to The Guardian, and said that any leftist worth his or her salt will basically, you should read the article, but basically blindly support the NATO intervention. And then he says some very contradictory things, which is he's prone to do. But we should support NATO, but like not with the US leading it. Like what do you like, NATO is the US, it just makes no sense. It's completely incoherent. Which is another thing that they do, is they traffic in obscurantism and pseudo-dialectics, right? So Zizek said about just about everything and just about the opposite of everything. And the point is to produce objects of consumption that people buy and need to buy, because it's like, oh, this is his latest hot take that's different than the other hot take. So a lot of these figures have actually really revealed their colors because they've supported US imperialism and said that's where they stand. Just like Horkheimer was saying back in the day that he supported the war in Vietnam.
I just want to ask one last question, and then we'll open it up. But since you talked a lot about the misinformation campaigns during the Cold War, what about now?
Yeah, great question. I think there's a few things that are important to understand about now. One is that the institutional infrastructure that has been set up in the intellectual apparatus has a certain inertia to it. And that's all still very much in existence. And now we have generation upon generation who've been trained within this kind of general doxa, if you will, and that means that it's become the general kind of lingua franca of the day. The other thing that I'd say is that there's arguably been even a greater consolidation and greater centralization, right? With the top-down class warfare that has been unleashed with neoliberalism on steroids, kind of post-91, it means that now you can really discipline intellectuals, right? Because there aren't jobs out there, because 70% of the US labor pool in the academy is adjunct. Like, this really creates, and there's a CIA document that says precisely this, right? That the more we keep the intellectual labor pools precarious, the more we can control what the narrative is. And 5, just as a side note regarding the media, 5 gigantic media conglomerates control 90% of what all people see and hear within the United States. So there's an unbelievable media monopoly that is important. As far as other things are concerned, I might just jump to the ways in which, like, the Central Intelligence Agency has, for years, but now increasingly so, been working with a lot of private intelligence agencies in various ways, so outsourcing this labor, and it has also used the United States Information Agency, the USIA, the United States Agency for International Development, the USAID, NGOs, the NED that I mentioned earlier, the National Endowment for Democracy. They have this entire global infrastructure, basically, for promoting propaganda worldwide. The digital age has also brought with it unique opportunities for even greater control of the circulation of information. I mean, we've seen this very clearly with the very overt censorship and deplatforming of anyone who is taking a progressive line. I'm not talking about revolutionary socialists or Marxists or anything, just a progressive line in the US media sphere. I'm just talking about the US because I've been there over the last 2 years and seen it happen up close. RT being basically expunged, the deplatforming of so many people, etc. There's a really fascinating article that recently came out, just to give you a sense of their involvement with big tech, because big tech isn't some private sector that's separate from the intelligence agencies. On the contrary, these, Amazon has, if I remember correctly, it hosts cloud space for the CIA. Google, of course, contracts with the intelligence services. I mean, these are hand in glove. Don't believe the hype about private-public. It's nonsense. Here's something to think about. So in 2021, last year, the Pentagon's signature reduction program, it was revealed, has an undercover force of 60,000 people, some of whom are involved in assuming false personas online and engaging in espionage, as well as influence and manipulation campaigns. This same report says that every military intelligence and special operations unit has developed some kind of web operations cell that both collects intelligence and tends to the operational security of its activities. Right, so if anybody followed what some people call the Bay of Tweets around Cuba, where there was a destabilization effort, that are ongoing destabilization efforts with a stranglehold around Cuba that is enforced by the US empire, there was enormous social media conflagration that now has been studied in great detail. And it's very clear that it was an intelligence operation to create a tweet storm with SOS Cuba and make what was a very small protest around access to electricity and other such things that are linked to the draconian sanctions and embargo into this enormous uprising against the government, right? Which it wasn't. And in fact, there are many images that were then circulated in this international propaganda campaign that were images of the pro-Cuban, not protests, but marches and things like this, that were labeled as anti-Cuba. And again, very well documented. There's lots of good sources on this that I could share with you. And so this is just a larger media ecosystem. And of course, within the intellectual world, this is a big part of what's going on. In fact, did anyone see the Paul Mason revelations just recently? This week, I would very strongly recommend. Do people know Paul Mason? Yeah, he's probably one of the top 5 most famous progressive journalists, labeled progressive, I put that in quotes, in Great Britain. Has an enormous platform, Guardian, BBC, etc. And somebody hacked his emails. And what came out? Well, what came out was that he has been corresponding with intelligence operatives about basically, if you read through it, I'll give it very quickly, the need to set up the equivalent of the IRD that I was talking about a moment ago, meaning a propaganda network of media assets and academics in order to slander and destroy progressive voices within the media and within the academy. And he even has, you see in his email, he has a chart that he outlined where he names particular people. It's completely chaotic, like the people, and he names people like Vijay Prashad. You know, if you know Vijay Prashad, he's like a really well-known academic, historian, journalist, like who's progressive. He names Carlos Martinez. That name might remind you of a name that you've heard before, because he's going to be here next week, right? So this type of stuff is not only going on now, it's like just been revealed last week of what some of these operations look like. There are, well, there's a series of reports that we can share with you and some podcasts on it that are quite good. And so I think that we have to be very vigilant about how the intellectual apparatus within the capitalist world is still trying to control the narrative and make sure, basically, that there's not a free and open debate about ideas, right? All the myths of like, everything's on the table, we can talk about anything, the university is an open platform. No, it's not. The university is very tightly controlled by what counts as valid ideas. And so in that regard, I think that if you have any takeaway, I hope it is that we have to develop modalities of critique that aren't just kind of internal critiques, if you will, or critiques that remain within these unspoken parameters, right? You can be critical of capitalism, but you have to just slander anything that would be an alternative. Instead, we have to open up the parameters of critique so that we can also take into account the institutional apparatus that itself is forging the intellectuals who are putting forth these messages in various ways.
Well, then why don't we go ahead and open up for questions? Yeah, we can, well, why don't we go ahead and we'll take maybe 3 questions? Do you guys want to start?
Oh, and do turn on the mic if you have,
I'll just try to yell. So yeah, maybe I'll talk a lot because this is my area of interest, but I'll just start by mentioning that Paul Mason, the piece on Paul Mason, I saw one, a 2-parter on Midpress News.
Yeah.
So anyone, I think the journalist is Andrew Cook, but it's a really great piece. And so like, my question was originally going to be about like people that you would describe as radical recuperators working today, and my question was going to be about Zizek specifically, because like my research into propaganda, like I had read like a lot of Zizek in my 20s, and his work is about like ideology, and I realized when I started like researching, the CIA and their role in the production and dissemination of propaganda, I was like, Zizek, at no point in like the 8 books that I've read on ideology does he mention this, and I found that so suspect, and then that was confirmed by his latest article on Ukraine. I was so heartbroken and disappointed. But so you already mentioned him, so my question is, I'm a socialist and I'm an activist and organizer, and as you've laid out so in such detail, this security apparatus and their power to disseminate and infiltrate, culture institutions, journalism, popular media, all of these facets of, what we consume as information. How can we, outside of, media literacy and being aware of these things, how can we put this knowledge into, practice and find a way to combat this, huge onslaught of anti-communist, and not just, because it is anti-communist, but it's also like in the case of Zizek, someone who identifies himself as a Marxist, but it's such a it's a pessimistic, you know, worldview where you read it and you're just left immobilized and almost like, all right, throw your hands up and, you know, accept the misery. So, yeah.
I'm just going to repeat that real quick to sum it up for the people online. It was a question of how do we put this knowledge into practice beyond media literacy? You know, knowledge about this anti-communist propaganda, but also the kind of promotion of a sort of defeatist so-called politics.
Okay, so my question is not exactly the same question, but it is kind of along the same lines, and it has a very general version of the question, and then more specific. So my first, the more general part is following your analysis, your incredible analysis of the intervention of all this apparatus, this agents of the intelligence apparatus, and right into the production of intellectual life, of culture, etc. Seeing the amount, the expanse, and the intensity of that effort, shouldn't that also mean for us as organizers, as you know, the ones, you know, who see ourselves as revolutionaries, shouldn't that also mean for us that this field holds a whole lot of importance, right? And if that is the case, then also, you know, similar to the question that Eduardo was making, aside from sort of like denouncing, right, like the material reality of those networks of influence, of funding, and all of that, what else could we do? And again, going back to my question from last week, again, as academics, most of us here are or will be working mainly in a classroom. Should we just give up that space of the bourgeois classroom in a bourgeois university? Should we denounce everything that you're denouncing now? And the specific question would be, should we go one step ahead in the specific context of the classroom and maybe teach alternative lineages of intellectual tradition that are about liberation and not about, you know, sophisticated neologisms or whatever, you know, anti-communism is disguising itself as. And if so, who would you include in that potential list or lineage? I'm just asking for a friend.
Just to sum this up, the question was, seeing the intensity of this propaganda effort, doesn't this also mean that this field, that is culture and information, holds a great deal of importance for us as socialists? So beyond denunciation, what can we do specifically as academics and as teachers? Should we also teach about traditions of liberation, and who specifically might you recommend we teach about? And we'll take one more, go ahead and use the mic.
Okay. Yeah, thanks for that. It was really interesting. I'm sort of interested, you said that you had had discussions with Rancière about these topics, and I'm wondering, from what you know or what you can project or imagine, how these conversations are responded to within that sort of world of the compatible left. So even if you're not an out-and-out Marxist, if you're a theorist with a critique of power or of US imperialism or of institutions, you might sort of have a reason to cover for your affiliation with the CIA or with CIA-affiliated institutions. So what is sort of the logic or the rationale or the response, or what you imagine the response might be to a pretty straightforward critique asking why you're taking money from the CIA? So like, what's the intellectual response within the compatible left to the engagement with CIA-funded institutions, especially as this becomes more public, ideally more discussed in other academic traditions?
Right. Should I go ahead? Well, maybe I'll just work backwards then. Thank you for the great questions. I would say that the responses are a lot of people, the actual concrete responses that I know of, denied any knowledge whatsoever of the involvement, right? Hannah Arendt is a good example of this, acted surprised and shocked, which is highly revealing because these operations were within Western Europe that had been destroyed by World War II. All of a sudden you have all these academic networks that are flush with funds. And I think it's Jason Epstein who pointed this out. Like, it doesn't take an idiot, to figure out that the situation was such that the money must have been coming from someone with an agenda because it wasn't internal money, right? So there are just the basic coordinates that should have been clear. Those who had so much egg on their face that they couldn't deny it anymore, for the most part would say, well, I never wrote anything, I was never forced to write anything, right? Which is a really interesting response because it reveals their kind of liberal ideology, and that is that the presumption would be that it's a relationship between the freedom of the individual and some, structural determinant that's going to force you to do something. That's not how this works. The reason you got money is because you were freely and willingly towing the line. And so it's not about being controlled. They choose the people who they fund and support, and they have been remarkably consistent, right? I don't know, Patrice Lumumba didn't get a check from the CIA, and lots of other examples. And so those have been the main reactions. Working backwards, as far as the second question is concerned, there are so many internal documents from the Central Intelligence Agency and other agencies that I've looked at that say very explicitly the most important battle is the battle for hearts and minds. It's interesting, right? It is more difficult to slaughter people than to control them through their minds. Because if you slaughter people, you have to dispense those resources, you get blowback, people get angry, their children get armed and try to kill you, right? And so that's one of the reasons that this Ralph McGee, the CIA officer, says that's the central function, is the role, the battle for hearts and minds. And so I think both of your questions are, well, what is to be done about it given the context that we're in? And I do think that it's important to recognize that there is an institutional setting that has a certain amount of inertia. The US political culture, where I principally teach, is reactionary through and through. It's, I think, the most reactionary political culture, definitely in the modern world, but potentially in the history of the world. There might be some other, comparables, but what that means is that you have to deal with that particular context, but also find ways of connecting people to bring them in. And at least in my own teaching, one of the principal ways of doing that is begin by simply saying, let's be open-minded about things. Let's actually investigate what's going on in the world. Let's not start with the presumption that there are things that we can't read. Let's share information, be open, investigate, and then maybe we'll be critical in various ways. And so I think you're absolutely right that we have to teach alternative lineages. And that's what I do regularly myself. And that those lineages, I think that there are intellectual lineages related to those who are developing intellectual tools to understand and transform the world, right? The historical materialist tradition is one of those. One of the principal ones. There are others as well that I also teach because I think people should know about them, various indigenous struggles, anarchist struggles, and other such things. But there's also just liberation struggles straight up, right? To find out, well, how did, the Burkina Faso people liberate themselves from French colonialism? What did that look like? Most people don't know the name, don't know where the country is. So we can start from a presumed ignorance because one of the things, maybe summing this up is I try to teach what I wasn't taught. I was never taught about liberation struggles. I was never taught about historical materialism. I was taught about the canonical history of Western metaphysics. And, I guess I know that stuff really well, but it doesn't seem really helpful for the state that we're in, right? We're in a world in which there's greater socioeconomic inequality than ever in the history of humanity. And we're facing an ecological crisis where the UN is now saying that human distinction is on the horizon. The stakes are very high. I can't read and reread Leibniz in that situation. I've got to teach things that are liberation struggle and intellectual tools that will help us liberate. And so as far as specific names go, there's a lot of them. Claudia Jones, Thomas Sankara, who I mentioned before, Ho Chi Minh, incredible writer. I'd look at Ernesto Che Guevara. I would look at Jose Carlos Mariátegui. I would look at, there's many, Villemé Espín. There's many, many people that I could think of. But the people who have been invested in human liberation and who have been developing theoretical tools for us to understand what human liberation looks like. And we don't read them because we're just going to take what they said and apply it to our circumstances or think it's absolutely right 100%. We're going to read them because we want knowledge that has use value, because we want to save humanity and hopefully planet Earth and the greater natural world. Regarding the first question, and of course cycle back if I haven't answered these, or we can continue the conversation. I will say just a quick note on Zizek, because I was the same way, right? That was my gateway drug to, I never read him in school, but I remember somebody saying when he published his very first book, Looking Awry, hey, this is this new thing, and I read it and I thought, wow, this is hot, this is really interesting, and it was a gateway to a certain form of Marxism that was fun, it was cool, it was interesting, it was radical chic. It wasn't like the, stereotype of the 75-year-old white male socialist who's on a pedestal, standing up on a soapbox on the corner, right? And that said, there can be value in that. That can bring people in, but we also have to identify it for what it is. And Slavoj Žižek is the court jester of capitalism who has made a mockery of Marxism. That is his global social function. The guy is a joke, right? And he's meant to be a joke. He tells funny jokes sometimes, I'll give it to him, right? Definitely, much more entertaining than a lot of other people, although he goes on at length. And he's incoherent. But he is giving an image of Marxism that is laughable. It's buffoonery. And that's why the capitalist ruling class supports him, because he's the jester. He makes everybody else look bad. And anytime you bring up Marxism in a classroom setting, people are going to be like, oh yeah, I've read Zizek. It's like, no, that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about materialist analysis and liberation struggles. We're not talking about the Lacanian real and looking at cervexes online. Chill the fuck out, man. Anyway, Eduardo, you were going to bounce back with something? Or?
Yeah, I was going to say that, that's why he's so effective and so dangerous, because he is such a buffoon, but at the same time, he talks out of both sides of his mouth. He's like, oh, I'm silly, I tell the dirty jokes, it's okay. But then he writes an article for The Guardian where he makes huge historical omissions and supports NATO expansion in a very serious manner. He's not making dirty jokes, and that's why figures like him are so dangerous, and we have to be so weird of him. Even, I've read so many of his books in my 20s, and when I realized this, I'm like, this guy talks about ideology throughout his whole career, and at no point does he mention how ideology is propped up materially.
Well, what he does, because he traffics in a form of transcendental idealism, meaning it doesn't matter what film he sees. The Lacanian real is fucking in there somewhere, right? And he's gonna find it. And
famously, he has armies of research students that watch films for him. He doesn't even watch them.
Yeah. Oh, well, I shouldn't do it maybe in a recorded setting, but I could tell horror stories about the way that man publishes and what he publishes and how it operates. I have. We'll get a drink later. This is the informal segment. Juan has one too.
No, I want to mention something by Gandhi, because now that
Can
we're
we
talking about...
can we try to use the microphone?
Well, I don't know, it is a good idea, but anyway, now that we're talking about institutions that were founded by this, Ford or Rockefeller, there's a French institution that is super important, and where on it is, the HESS. This university started like that too. It was part of the Rockefeller, and they tried to always split from that. No, we didn't. No, we're free to do whatever we want. But there's a lot of criticism behind this, because this university, I don't know if I should say it or not, but this is becoming something that should be critiqued in a lot of ways.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I feel like I didn't fully answer Eduardo's question just really quickly, because you're right that Zizek engages with ideas, and he pilfers elements from empirical reality that he situates within his intellectual framework, right? This isn't materialist analysis. The man is not looking at the system of cinematic production and who's funding what and all of the details of the political economy and cinema. Not at all. He's watching Hitchcock, finding Lacan, and he's basically, it's a form of projection in which the philosopher projects his or her great ideas onto the empirical content, right? So the lack of materialism is a real problem in everything that he does, and it's probably one of the reasons that he doesn't understand what's going on in Ukraine. The real question, or the second part of the question that you asked, though, is how to combat this, and I do think that it's really important to understand how this works. And so part of, at least not just my project, but I think a collective project, is to figure out how these institutions and how the intellectual apparatus functions, and to map it out. Because once you map it out, you can understand how it operates and how best to intervene in order to transform it, right? If you don't understand how it operates and you think, oh, there's just like one person who was paid by the CIA or whatever, you're not going to understand who your enemies are, right? You need a theoretical mapping. But the other thing that is really important is developing infrastructure for the production, circulation, and consumption of alternative ideas that have real transformative use value. We need alternative media platforms. We need alternative educational platforms. We need alternative publication platforms. And we need to develop it collectively so that there's infrastructure, material support for these forms of research, these types of conversations. I mean, obviously it's one of the things that we've been trying to do with the Critical Theory Workshop. We're nested within the academy, we work with the academy, we have academic debates, we have intellectual debates, but we also want to be bringing to the table things that have been largely expunged or excluded from the academy in various ways. And that means that the project can't be individual, right? It's not just about individuals and I'm going to publish a new book that's going to become more famous than Zizek's book or whatever. I mean, back in my rad lib opportunist days, I did think that way. They were bad times. I felt lonely and isolated and self-important. I'm really glad now that I'm working with a lot of other people to develop the type of infrastructure that we need, because we need a lot of it, and we need to do it quickly.
Let's take the two questions online. First, Emiliano.
Hey everybody. Yeah, so many questions, so little time. I think mostly I would like to focus on what I see as a particular phenomena that happens in the, within the US left, and my desire to try to find ways in which we can resuscitate the revolutionary socialist tradition of the US left. And I was thinking about the struggle that Chavez carried on in Venezuela. I was also hoodwinked by Foucault and Derrida, and I thought it was super cool because I had read all of Foucault's books, and then I was hoodwinked once again by Zizek, and now my illusions have come crashing. And but I think in some ways, I think Chavez and the project that Chavez developed of, in some ways, production, circulation, and reception were very interesting because he had to fight that battle, which in some ways necessitated, to continue the project of Simón Bolívar of unity, unity, unity. But at the same time, within the Venezuelan left and the Latin American left, there was this segment of what Chavez used to call the exquisite left, which were mostly the Trotskyites and some sectors of the left who will love any revolution that was not an actual existing revolution. Any theoretical form of revolutionary struggle was great, except the ones that actually existed. And in the context of the United States, one of the things that I feel is very important is to start making those distinctions between what is the historical materialist socialist revolutionary tradition and what it is this kind of Faux pseudo-radical identitarian form of politics that in some ways I think it has colonized every aspect of the academy, but it also has colonized places that you wouldn't think of, like for example, the Black Lives Matter movement. I lived in Minneapolis, 6 blocks away from the George Floyd Square. And I was very excited the first time I went to the George Floyd Square because I thought it was going to be some kind of Bolshevik, place of revolutionary organizing. And what I discovered was very, very disturbing, because what I saw was that these forms of academic pseudo-radical politics were being implemented in this space that was supposed to be revolutionary, right? And just to put an example so I make myself clear, I went there and there was a woman, a black woman, who was organizing the space and telling the white people to come to the front and the people of color to stay outside. And then she proceeded to chastise the white people because of all their privilege, and a black man who was standing by me said, "Oh, I'm not going to make you go to the front of the circle." And I turned around and I said, "But I'm not white," because as a Latin American, I don't feel like a white person in the context of the United States. Anyways, what surprised me is that these people, these white people who were at the center of the circle, were my neighbors. They were dishwashers. I know many of them were making minimum wage. And I know also that they were potential allies in the revolutionary struggle, right? But this kind of exclusionary politics has kind of taken hold in some ways of the US left. And I think we need to find ways to confront it in a way that allows us to carry on the project of creating a united mass movement that could actually take on the capitalist class, not from the perspective of identity, or not, I mean, we don't need to exclude those things, but from, rooted in a kind of historical materialist analysis of class. And I think that's what's missing from within the kind of dynamic that's taking place in the US now. So anyways, and I'll leave it there, and hopefully that's enough of a question.
Okay, and I think the other question is from Reese.
Hi, thank you so much for all of this fantastic historical detail, Gabriel. I was wondering if you would be willing to expand a little bit on some of the theoretical shortcomings of Adorno. We talked a lot about Rancière and Derrida, and what really internal to their thought is leading to some of these problems, namely this kind of transcendental idealism. Did you have that same kind of diagnosis of Adorno's thought? What is going wrong there? In the context, right, of course, of all of the funding issues and material productive background, right? Of course there's that, but then how is that influencing the theory itself? Because in particular you acknowledge that there is something that Adorno still can do, that Adorno is valuable for. And I'm wondering if that has to do with his negative claim and his positive claims that kind of leans into this negativity, both in an affective sense of this kind of pessimism, but also of making claims against certain kinds of structures, like being against capitalism. But then it's the shift to the positive claim of, so what should we do? What is to be done? Where Adorno falls short. I've heard that kind of an argument before. How would that fit in with your understanding of where Adorno is also going wrong theoretically, and how this material history of Adorno's theoretical production is influencing his theory?
Great questions. I guess I'll start with Emiliano's question. The very first part of it, I like the term of exquisite left, is fantastic. I didn't quite get some of the things regarding Chavez in Venezuela, but I do think there's a very good example of the attempt to develop alternative infrastructure in the case of Telesur. Because here you have a media platform, I think it just celebrated its 14-year anniversary or so, that is sharing information, investigative journalism, etc., that's outside of the mighty Wurlitzer. That's incredible, right? And that is also, video platforms available online and other such things. And I wasn't sure if you were alluding to other things in Venezuela, but at least that's what immediately came to mind. So I'll give a shout out to Telesur for the work that they've been doing. But more specifically, the case of identity politics and how it relates to class politics, I think that, and this overlaps with some of the things that Jennifer and Derek were talking about in the very first, or I guess second session, because I think of the first session as us drinking in the park. The identity politics, at least within the US context, really arose and became consolidated within the neoliberal conjuncture of about the 1970s to the present. And one of the things that identity politics and various forms of culturalism, because it took many different iterations and we should be able to identify them, right? It was political correctness, now it's wokeness, you know, it goes through different iterations, but the basic beast is still the same. And that is that you replace class politics by race politics or gender politics or sexual politics, and you oppose them, right, in a very non-dialectical fashion. And then you denigrate the non-compatible left as being people who are class reductionists and have no account of race or gender or sexuality or any of these things, right? And so it's really putting forth identity and culturalism as the primary focal point for your politics. And anybody who spent any time in an American classroom knows this, right? You always have to announce the point from which you're speaking, and you're always talking about what your various identities are, or inventing new identities in order to be able to you know, use them in the kind of marketplace of identities. And what that does politically is a number of things. One is that it completely divides and separates the working and toiling masses. Because instead of us sharing in common, what we all share in common, and that is that we have to work to survive. Like, we don't have gardens we can live off, like in the feudal era, and unless you're a trust fund baby, you're probably gonna have to get a job, right? Meaning that you're a member of the global proletariat in the very precise sense of the term. You do not have the means of subsistence. You have to work for someone else. You have to sell your labor power. That we all have, and is a very clear basis for politics and for identifying the fundamental undergirding problem in the contemporary world, and that is that our labor power is producing value that's being siphoned off and taken from us by parasites who are the ruling class. Instead of, in the case of socialism, taking that value and redistributing it in the form of universal healthcare, universal education, universal housing, and a universal right to employment, as well as a focal point on the full development of human beings as cultural beings, as sexual beings, as complex beings who can do different things and are not simply reducible to their vocation or their cog within the capitalist system. And the other thing that this does is it completely erases the entire history of liberation struggles that have been inspired in various ways by Marxism, that have been at the forefront, the vanguard of struggles for racial liberation, gender and sexual liberation. And it's remarkable, but it's just part of the lingua franca of the contemporary academy. People don't know this. Valentine Moghadam has a great study of the history of revolutions where she demonstrates that the Russian Revolution was the greatest liberation of women in any moment prior to that point in time and any moment since that time. Right? Women were integrated into leadership, women were given maternity leave, there was a socialization of care work. So you had teams of people who were workers who would clean all the houses, so the women didn't have to be trapped in drudgery and didn't have to do the social reproductive labor. There were kindergartens and there were care centers that were set up in order to do that labor and to take that seriously and not just outsource it to women as domestic slaves, right? In the United States, who was at the forefront of racial liberation in the interwar period? It was the Marxists who were organizing. That's a very well documented history. It's not known, but very well documented. So these people aren't class reductionists. They're not class reductionists at all. What they do is they recognize that there's a class relationship within which there are very specific modalities of super exploitation and oppression. And if you can create an ideology that says that, well, women should not be given a wage for taking care of children and doing housework and cleaning, then you super exploit them. Right? And you maintain these kind of patriarchal relationships of ownership and other such things, just as if you can create the myth that blacks are subhuman, then you can justify slavery, right? And so Emiliano's question, I think, really goes to the heart of, it's not saying, well, we need a class politics and you forget about all, you know, race and gender and sexuality. No, class politics is a foundational and structural element for different ways in which we can struggle concretely and materially against super exploitation and oppression. This doesn't mean waving a BLM flag or like speaking in certain ways. It means material change. It doesn't mean, you know, allowing another voice in the room or only that. It means actually changing the conditions of production so that women aren't subjected to domestic slavery and racialized groups aren't subjected to super exploitation, right? That requires structural change, not gestural politics. And that's what identity politics is. It's gestural politics and it's symbolic politics that divides the working masses, and it's not by chance that it's gone hand in hand with neoliberalism, and it has a deeper history and the deep history of social chauvinism in general, because it's a way of destroying progressive organizing. Because then, as you were pointing out, instead of having a basis for our solidarity, and that is that we're all workers, and some of us have been super exploited, and some of us have been oppressed, but guess what? We're bonding together in a common struggle. We have a politics in which we're divided and fighting against each other, and saying that the real fundamental issue is about identity, not about our common struggle for liberation, which includes racial, gender, sexual liberation, and other forms of liberation for that matter. So anyway, I got a little fired up there and could say a lot more about that, but I'll leave it there. Reese, really interesting question and point. Adorno has a complex corpus, of course, right? So there's a lot going on there. I would say that there are certain elements that I take to be the best elements in Adorno's work where he takes directly from the historical materialist tradition. His analysis of the history of sound recording and its impact on music, it's really solid and interesting historical work that provides us with some elements of a political economy, but then more specifically a materialist economy of how recordings operate, how they circulate, what their impact is on musical production. It's really interesting work. Some of the other work that he does, I think, transition more into a kind of transcendental idealism of sorts in which there's a large conceptual structure and then empirical data is just sandwiched within it. Dialectic of Enlightenment, there's some insightful things in that book about the culture industry and other such things. There are also unbelievable abstractions that are kind of laughable from a historical point of view. They're just, they're so conceptually abstract that that I don't find them particularly helpful. And I would also say that within a book like Dialectics of Enlightenment and some of his other work, he traffics in a lot of enforced obscurantism. And one of the problems with a lot of radical theorists is that there's the assumption that the more difficult it is to understand your discourse, the smarter it is. When in fact, it's often the opposite. The clearer that you are in elucidating something means that you actually want to communicate, connect with people, share resources with them, be part of a collective project. That's being intelligent, if by intelligence we mean working on a collective project of elucidating the world so that we can gain a grip over it. I think you're right that in many ways, the positive claims, Adorno basically doesn't have any. He says that only despair can save us, again and again and again. Some of the negative claims I think are helpful, right? They're good, some of them are good critiques of consumer society. Jennifer and I on Wednesday are going to talk about aesthetics, and I do have a lot of problems with the larger aesthetic project that Adorno has for a number of reasons, one of which is that he basically defines aesthetics in terms of bourgeois aesthetics, even though at times he says he doesn't. If you look at his theoretical practice, what is he analyzing? He's analyzing bourgeois aesthetics. He's not looking at quote-unquote folk culture, at dance practices. He's looking at the performances for the bourgeoisie of dance and music and art and things like this. And so there's an assumption that is highly problematic, and that is what counts as art is bourgeois art. Not culture writ large. Mary Louise Pratt, I'm sure will touch on this as well. Not the culture that we make, right? But the culture that's elevated above people like us and that is institutionalized and is part of the bourgeois project of adorning itself and making it look like imperial Rome and so when you take those horizons as the horizons of art, you are basically being a bourgeois philosopher of art who's shoring up and protecting bourgeois art, and moreover, making a very incorrect assumption, and that is that there's a magical relationship between this bourgeois art and social transformation. And the causal linkages can never be explained because there are none, because it's mystical thinking. It's superstition. Sorry.
Great. We'll take another round here. We have Umberto, and then, sorry, can you remind me of your name? Wait, and anybody else? The third one? And then Esteban. Okay. And then, can you take 4?
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
Yeah, we should say because we have 5 minutes left. And so today we're not going to judge you if you leave early, so you can peel off if you need to. So no.
Okay.
I want to apologize because I do need to leave a little bit early, but I still want to phrase my question because it's something that is so important for my research. It's just when I was working to do my prospectus, I did a lot of research about like the culture of the Congress of Cultural Freedom and basically Cold War politics and how they influence cultural production around the world. And one of the things that at some point I started, I don't know, feeling a little bit uncomfortable with is that the more I read this piece of information, basically the more I felt like I was sort of like intoxicated by a way of thinking about the world that very much mimicked the vision of the CIA of the world. So I was feeling like I was believing the CIA completely when I read all of these informs about how they gave money to all of these organizations and they organized the universities, etc., etc. And I was wondering, when you're working on this, how do you leave space for personal agency, one? And then also, how do you think about geopolitical forces that do not follow the binary schema of the, digamos, the upper level Cold War between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, right? I'm thinking more about precisely like the Third World, or for example, Mexico or Latin America and the place of the Cuban Revolution that didn't really follow that schema, right?
If you have to leave early, should I respond really quickly and then we'll go to the others? Yeah. So I think you're absolutely right that there's a dialectical relationship between personal agency and structural forces, and that we always have to be attentive to that level of personal agency, and so it depends on the cases. The elements that I've read about the history of what the CIA has said it's done itself, themselves always need to be contextualized. Because there are instances that are very clear where the CIA has documents that are they don't correspond to material reality, they're fabricated, right? And they also do a lot of things that they don't document on purpose. So you have to have a general understanding of the modus operandi of the company, as they call it, the CIA, in order to try to navigate that and compare and contrast different narratives in various ways to try as best as you can to get to the bottom of what's going on. And I think you're right that if I heard you correctly, regarding kind of third world anti-colonial struggles in general, if they be aligned on the Soviet Union, supported by the Soviet Union or not, has been one of the principal terrains that the CIA has been interested in, because they want to control the third world, or so-called third world, and in doing that, they have expended an enormous amount of energy in obviously controlling what's going on politically and economically, but also intellectually, right? And setting up various forms of organizational relations and other such things. In fact, one of the things that I didn't mention is there's an excellent book by Raúl Antonio Capote that's entitled El Enemigo. He's a Cuban who worked for the CIA up until the 21st century. So it's within the 21st century, I believe, primarily. Very interesting book, because he was also working for the Cuban intelligence services. So he was actually, and it's a good case of agency, right? He was pulling one over on the Central Intelligence Agency and then told the whole story in this book, and it's a remarkable, remarkable story. And the evolution of Cuba has been, it's complex. It's gone through different stages. It's had different alignments and things like this. But I don't know if that responds to some of your question, or were you aiming at something else?
Yeah, I'm just thinking about how to distance ourselves from the narrative created by the CIA for once,
yeah.
And both in terms of political and basically political ideas in a globalized.
Yeah, well, the CIA too. If you read Tim Wisner's, is it Tim Wisner? I think that's his name. Tim Weiner, maybe. The two big New York Times bestseller books. One is on the CIA, the other was on FBI. These are intelligence assets publications. Like, you have to situate them for what they are. That's very different than Philip Agee's book, The CIA Diary, right? He worked for the CIA for years in Latin America, and then he told his whole story and was tracked by the CIA. In fact, he came to Paris and was in London, and then told an incredible story about how the CIA was trying to prohibit him from publishing that material. And so I think we really have to, absolutely, we have to do good situated analysis and compare and contrast resources. There's a history of the Congress for Cultural Freedom that was published by the CIA that's available on their website. It gets a lot of it right, like basic facts, but it also has a very clear agenda, right? So, and that's where hermeneutics comes in, right? The ability to interpret and compare and contrast texts and do it in such a way where ideally you're not just taking something at face value, but you're asking the questions of who produced it, who paid for its production, why was it produced, what line are they towing, like all of the important critical questions. Yeah.
Is Mama?
Thank you so much, that was really interesting.
Oh, could you speak into the microphone?
Oh, yeah, sure. Thank you, that was really interesting. Something that, so there's maybe kind of a practical question, but something that struck me when you were speaking about these kind of themes and ideas is that a lot of them sort of, the pivot from like COVID to Ukraine and like this sort of idea of the CIA and all the material reality rather than the CIA. But a lot of them correspond to these quite contemporaneous like alt-right critiques or so-called conspiracies of that. And I'm wondering how do, and those sort of platforms that have those ideas have such a huge following that also, I guess, can be the locus for some quite other toxic ideas. So as leftists, how do we engage with those sorts of groups, and how do we sort of marshal those sentiments toward leftist ends rather than, when there may be a kernel of truth to some of these conspiracies that they sort of, I guess, traffic in, but it comes from a toxic place and often goes in quite toxic directions, I suppose.
Esteban?
Thank you very much for the talk. Well, my question was initially again about the materialist part of dialectical materialism, but your explanations on class structure kind of responded to what I had in mind. So, but anyway, the question would be, well, at least the first part would be, well, where should we stop the dialectical understanding of things in order to say things like the real materialist, sorry, the material reality, as you said, right? Even if I sympathize a lot with dialectical understanding of what happens in general in social reality and of course material explanations, I have troubles when I hear things like the material reality itself or material reality themselves. So if you could say something more about it, it would be great. And the second part, concerning the explanations regarding class structures, which are very illuminating in order to understand my first question, I think, is, in order to consider those alternatives that you mentioned related to more infrastructure, alternative ways of organizing, is it also possible to think of different notions of information or different ways of communicating instead of building more competition on the basis of the same notion of information, like the working class sometimes needs to needs to turn it off, to say it briefly, just stop listening to the misinformation and maybe do something else, or I don't know. In particular, how would you understand an alternative notion of information in materialist terms, like being a notion that it seems very like abstract, but at the same time depends a lot of technologies and legal systems that today we're having like this based on neural rights and such kinds of stuff. Thanks.
Isabella?
Thank you for everything. So my question could be more like an extension of maybe something that has been already said, but so I'm coming from Irvine. Well, the critical theory is very important, and all the people that you mentioned were there or have some kind of relationship with the place, and it's very like I don't know, like unsettling to me to see that people like Derrida or Ponce de León that you have been criticizing today were in Irvine have been being criticized by Afro-pessimists.
Yeah.
So it's hard to situate yourself between what type of theory, right? So, and you mentioned that then historical materialist thinking could be like an option, and liberation struggles will be like an example of this. But I wonder then, so how can we build like a critique without also idealizing, fetishizing these other struggles, right? Or how can we, because of course they all have, how can we avoid like falling into identitarian formulations as well by saying that, I don't know, like critiquing Derrida by his political or inaction or inaction, you know what I mean? So how can we situate ourselves within all this messy map of critical theory?
Yeah. Hugo, did you want to tag one on?
Yeah, sorry. I would like to follow up on what Isabel is asking, because I found absolutely interesting the notion of intellectual apparatus, because I think it corrects Bourdieu's idea of the intellectual field that is autonomous. And now we have the politics in that.
Yeah.
So I was thinking, for many, many years, we were used to Lukács being scorned for his participation in Soviet politics.
Yeah.
So I would say, to what extent, and I really appreciate the research that you're doing, to which extent we don't risk doing the same on the other side, and just saying this is blatantly non-productive because it's produced at a certain stage of politics. Because when the critique of Lukács was there, the idea was the intellectual has to produce autonomous. But that's an illusion from the capitalist idealism. So to which extent, my question will be, how can we build the criticism of theories and categories that takes into account the political, but doesn't use it as the only mechanism of offsetting or counterbalancing different narratives? Like, how can we, and that's a project like for the future, right? What would be the methodological way of putting again to talk Lukács and Adorno, now making ourselves consciousness of all the determinations that surrounded that discussion from both sides? I think that has a lot to do with what Isabella was saying.
Yeah. Really great and interesting questions. I'm going to do my best. I might start kind of at the end and work back. I think it's really important not to fetishize anything. Just as I was saying, don't fetishize Derrida or Ponce de León. You also shouldn't fetishize particular liberation struggles or particular figures. Like, we're human beings and we're trying to figure stuff out, but just as we shouldn't fetishize our own parents, we should recognize they're human beings, right? They're kind of messed up too, and they messed us up, and we're kind of just dealing with it in various ways. And the other thing that I would say in a less anecdotal fashion is that critique and self-critique is the lifeblood of the left. The right doesn't do this. They don't subject themselves to self-critique. And by right, I have a pretty expansive notion of the right that includes a lot of just pro-capitalist, right? I'm not just talking about like extreme right. They don't, announce mea culpa, we messed up. We're going to really change our politics. We're going to shift things considerably. No, but the left does. And that's actually one of the single most important things, is a collective tradition of self-critique in which we remain open to those critiques, we take them seriously, and it's not simply theoretical. We change our practices, right? And I could give lots of examples of this. We actually talked about gender and sexuality. There's lots of critiques of Cuba in the 60s and 70s for their position on gender and sexuality. What did they do? And there were problems. They should be pointed out. They should be highlighted. We should know about what those problems were, where they came from as well, right? Because they also came from the deep history of machismo within Latin America, and a lot of them predated the Cuban Revolution. But through a process of self-critique, they transformed quite considerably the institutional apparatus for supporting LGBTQ folks, for also educating the general population. They just were working on the new family code, and the new family code has a very expansive notion, and it's a family code based on, input from the entire society, a very expansive notion of what a family is that's largely self-defined as opposed to being the bourgeois nuclear family with domestic slavery and other such things. So that's just one example of the importance of self-critique. And the other question more about intellectuals, it's true that people like Lukács or Gramsci in the early 20th century, they were involved in political organizing very explicitly, and Gramsci spent most of his life in prison because of that. A lot of the later intelligentsia within the Western world was not, and they were severed from it in various ways, either willfully or, in many cases it was willful. And so I take it that some of the other questions, both of the questions have to do with, well, how do we situate ourselves in these landscapes, and what do we do as intellectuals and within the theoretical world? I do think there's an enormous power to theory. I could quote someone like Lenin who said that, there is not practice without theory. We all have theories of how the world works and what we're supposed to do to change it. But what we need to do is develop better, more coherent, more theories that also have more leverage, are able to really latch onto the world and change it in significant ways. And in my experience at least, and this might be where we have slightly different vantage points, I think that some of the theorists that we're talking about, I always have what I would call a variegated hermeneutics. I don't just read somebody and say, well, it's all crap or it's all fantastic, right? Just as we shouldn't fetishize anything, we also shouldn't say, in certain cases, like Henry Kissinger, I don't think has a lot of good stuff going on. But there are people who, as I was saying about Adorno, I've learned some things from him. I've learned some things from reading Bolivar. I've even learned some things from reading Derrida, even though I think his politics are bad, and I think that he's a poor reader in certain instances. And so with bourgeois cultural production, and it's also a problem really there's a big debate within the Cuban history about, well, what do we do with bourgeois cultural production? I think that you have to recognize that bourgeois cultural production is largely the result of an intellectual apparatus within the capitalist world. But what this means is that these were the people who were identified, for better or worse, as having the most potential as artists, as intellectuals, etc. They were given incredible resources to do what they were to do. And there are elements that we can take and learn from in various ways. But I think we also, dialectically, have to understand that they're also operating within a system that largely controls the parameters of what's possible. And so in pointing out the parameters of what's possible, I'm interested in intellectuals who are connected to struggles. Because the state of the world, right? I've got kids. The planet is being dissolved. Nuclear war and World War III is on the horizon. I don't think it's alarmist to say that there couldn't be a better time to connect intellectual work to practical work in a way that the Western, and it's important, it's in the Western capitalist core, has not done for a long time. Latin America has a big tradition of it. Africa has other places have deep traditions of it, but within the capitalist core it hasn't happened as much. So I don't know if, some of these questions seem like things we might follow up on and have a further conversation about. But if I work back up, just to, in the interest of time, about material reality itself, I would simply say that human beings are the result of a material reality that precedes us and surpasses us. We don't know the limits of the universe. And therefore, human thought has to be understood as a product of these broader material forces. But when I say material reality, I'm not saying that like an empiricist would say. Empiricists would say, there is just this world and it is precisely this and I can objectively understand it. No, a materialist would say, there is a world out there that has formed the history of Homo sapiens and me and how I think, but the only way I can understand it is through the categories that I've inherited from my culture and my situatedness in society. And therefore, when I describe this material reality, it's dialectically mediated by my conceptual framework, right? So any empirical reality in a brute sense, I could never apprehend it because it's mediated by my sensory apparatus, by my conceptual apparatus, by the words that I have, like material reality and things like this. And that, you know, Lenin is actually really good on describing how dialectics is, amongst other things, the process of learning from the limits of our own thought. Learning how our categories are much more limited than the infinite complexity of the empirical world. And so one thing we have to do, and this comes back to theory, is develop theoretical tools that allow us to capture better, to describe better, the material world and its infinite complexity. And by describe better, that's not just a theoretical project. It's being able to describe them in such a way that you can get a handle on them and intervene practically, if it be in a direct political sense or just more generally, like actually be able to make a table as opposed to not be able to make a table. The second thing, the different forms of information where my mind immediately went, and I see Emiliano's projected here on the screen, who's a well-known Brechtian, is to Brecht. Because when you were asking about how to share information, what we're doing here is mediated by discourse and a few hand gestures, and that's as good as we get. But communication, human communication, is so much broader than that. And we'll talk about this with aesthetics. And one of the things that's so powerful in Brecht's work is he talked about form. And the way Brecht understood form is that form is the way in which you take an understanding and you mediate it through whatever it might be. It can be language, it can be song, it can be dance, it can be performance, it can be music, in order to communicate to someone else. And the form is principally important because sometimes the best way to communicate to whomever it might be is a dance performance, is getting someone, one of the reasons that I got interested in transformative politics was getting wrapped up in the punk scene, right? The punk scene wasn't an academic lecture saying, hey dudes, we gotta be alternative. No, it was people who were stage diving and a sense that, well, we can do a different world and we don't like this other world that's very conformist, and there are limits to that, of course, but there's also the form that brings people into different ways of understanding. And so this expansive notion of form is really important. I think we'll come back to this because Jen and I have worked a lot on this in aesthetics. Conspiracy theory question is great. I will just say really quickly that the notion of conspiracy theory has been so widespread within the Western world, beginning, I'll look at the precise date, since 1967, because the CIA made a very explicit decision to label as conspiracy theorists anyone who questioned the Warren Commission report on the JFK assassination. And they specifically identified that in all of their press assets, anyone who said, well, maybe JFK wasn't killed by a lone gunman would be labeled as a conspiracy theorist. So there's a weaponization of conspiracy theory in order to discredit materialist analyses of history. And I'd be happy to talk about the Kennedy assassination because there's a lot of things that people should know about it because it reveals how the US state works and who's really in control. But I'll leave that aside and instead say that you're absolutely right that there are a lot of people, particularly within a reactionary culture like the US, who have these right-wing conspiratorial theories where they do get certain things right. The bigwigs, the fat cats, they steal from you. They're out to get you. That's true. The government is against you. That's true, right? And so one of the things, and thinking here of Eduardo's question a little earlier on, is that we want to be educators not just in a classroom. We want to be involved in political organizing, in connecting to people, in broader popular education. And so for me, one of the best ways of dealing with this is that you have to recognize that ideology functions like a gestalt. It takes empirical data from the world and it formats it in an explanatory framework. Have people seen, there's the great image of the duck rabbit image? It's an image and you look at it, it looks like a duck, and you look again and it's a rabbit. but it's the same image. That's a gestalt shift, right? And so what I think is important to do in outreach, in connecting with people who have some right factual ideas, they see the lines in the drawing, you have to get them to see a rabbit instead of a duck, or vice versa. Meaning, you have to allow them to identify, you know, your real enemy isn't the immigrants. These are working people whose lives were destroyed and they're coming to this country to try to survive. Your enemies aren't the black people who have been subjected to horror upon horror in the history of U.S. U.S. capitalism. Your real enemies are those who have constructed a system where you have to work yourself to death, and where your kids get poisoned by water that's not drinkable. Those are your real enemies. So take the facts, validate them. Be like, yeah, you're right about that. You're absolutely right. But then help give them the frame and through the form of understanding that allows them to see who their true enemies are, and then they can be brought on board. Ideally, if you're good at doing it. But it's also like those messages have to be reiterated. You have to have a culture that actually does that. One of the things that's powerful about a lot of Latin American societies is that there's a kind of culture of progressivism. So you're not just one person saying, hey, guess what? There's a different way of thinking. There are bookstores and there are performances, and there's just a kind of vital leftist culture that was decimated in the United States. Unfortunately, but that is rebuilding really quickly. Because like the many-headed hydra, it comes back. Because reality is radical and people recognize that the system doesn't work. It should be quite obvious given unemployment levels and the housing crisis and many, many other things. Oh, okay. So I'll just read the question real quick. I don't know if everybody can see it. This is Sabrina. I'm wondering about the division of mental and manual labor and the relationship between the sort of intellectual proletariat, as academics are kept precarious, as Gabriel pointed out, and the manual labor workers who are more overrepresented in the global south. How does collective organization work across this division? Yeah, it's an important point, because one of the things that capitalism has done historically is it divides those who have the right to work with their mind and those who have to work with their hands. They underpay the latter, they usually pay a little bit more the former, and it's also a form of class warfare, because then you can develop the professional intelligentsia who's paid a little bit more to make sure that the ideas, the gestalt that's given to the general working class is a gestalt that doesn't allow them to see what's going on and doesn't allow them to see the real enemies. So it's an enormous, enormous problem. And of course, a lot of socialist organizing is about breaking down those borders. And so popular education is about validating the ideas of working people, because ideas come from practice. And if you want to know somebody who knows something about exploitation, talk to somebody who's working as a dishwasher, as somebody mentioned earlier, or a lot of other. I worked construction for years. That's one of the ways in which I understood what exploitation was. You work 14-hour days in rural Kansas when it's 104 degrees in the summer. You figure it out pretty quickly. You don't need to actually read many books to understand it. But part of the socialist project as well is validating that knowledge that manual laborers have about material reality, but then also providing an intellectual framing that allows us to move from existential level of experience to a more objective apprehension, so that you don't just know what your experience is, you see how your experience was produced by a system and is producing other people who are having similar experiences, and therefore it allows for systemic analysis. And so maybe the only other thing that I would say is this is one of the reasons that a lot of organizations that cut across these divides are so important. So if it be parties, various associations, unions, or other organizations that bring together people who are working within the intellectual realm and as working class people, because one of the problems in the university is you're in a bubble, and if you're only talking to other people, you don't realize like how actual people live, these rat-infested homes and like the stuff they have to deal with day in and day out, because your material reality is protected from it. And so the organizations, associations, and parties that do that really it's also about educating the intellectuals, right? It's not only about giving an intellectual frame to workers, it's about educating intellectuals about what real life looks like and how their work might be able to contribute to that in various ways.
Are there any final questions, or should we go ahead and wrap up? It's already late. Thank you all so much. Thank you, Gabriel.